to The War, the fashion label that you create. Today we're making the puff sleeve wrap dress in red linen. It has a front and back neck facing that gives a nice clean finish across the neckline. It has a puffy sleeve head with elasticated sleeve to create a puffy effect. It has a wrap front which is held in place with an internal tie and has a removable tie at waist. The skirt has a nice ruffly full finish that has a 1 centimetre double turned hem. So within your kit you've got 16 pattern pieces all cut to your size. The neck facing pieces have all been fused, that's piece 12, 13 and 14. You have the paper pattern to refer to if you need to for any points like gathering. There are 2 bias bind straps for the internal waist tie, 1 spool of thread, your 7mm elastic for the sleeve hem, and 2 safety pins to pull through your tie. First you want to take piece 1, top back, and place it right sides together with piece 2, top front right. First we're going to pin together the side seam and the shoulder seam of these 2 pieces. Then you want to take piece 3, top front left, and do the same. It's pinning together the side seam and the shoulder seam. Now we're going to sew each of these seams that we've just pinned together at 1 centimetre seam allowance. So all of the seams that we just pinned can be finished in this exact same way. With 1 centimetre seam allowance and reverse stitching your ends. Take your 2 sleeve pieces, 4 and 5, and fold them into half with fabric facing right sides together. Pin along the sleeve side seam. Sew your sleeve side seams at 1 centimetre seam allowance, remembering to back tack the ends. Take piece 6 skirt back and pieces 7 and 8 skirt fronts. Place piece 7 skirt front left on top of piece 6 skirt back with fabric facing right sides together. To tell which edge is the side seam, look for the notch. Match the notches and pin along the side seam edge. Do the same with piece 8 front skirt right, matching it up to piece 6 skirt back and pinning the side seams together. Ensure to match your notches as you pin. Sew along the skirt side seam at 1 centimetre seam allowance. Piece 9 is the back skirt ruffle. Pieces 10 and 11 are the front skirt ruffles and need to be joined to either side of the back ruffle. Place pieces 10 and 11 on either side of piece 9 with right sides of fabric together. Pin and sew these 2 seams at 1 centimetre seam allowance. To make your waist tie, take pieces 15 and 16 and place together with fabric right sides touching. Pin along the side seam edge and sew at 1 centimetre seam allowance. Once you have sewn all of your seams together, we want to finish these seams with an overlock stitch, or if you don't own an overlocker, you can zigzag stitch this finish. Now we are going to complete the top of the dress by finishing the neckline. Before we add the facing to the neckline, we need to stay stitch the neckline edge, and we're sewing this at a 4mm seam allowance, so that it sits inside the seam when you add the neckline and you can't see it. Grab neckline facing pieces 12, 13 and 14. Place piece 13 front neck facing left on top of piece 12 back neck facing with fabric right sides together and pin the shoulder seam. Make sure you match the notches at this point. Do the same with piece 14 front facing right. Place on top of the back neck facing, pinning the shoulder seam. Sew along these shoulder seam edges at 1 centimetre seam allowance. So you want to match the centre back notch of your back top with the centre back notch of your neckline facing and pin those together. Then you want to perfectly match your shoulder seam of your top to the shoulder seam of the facing piece. And pin those together. Do the same on the other shoulder. And then there are also 2 notches on your front neckline, which you need to match also, and match your hem. Match the notch on the front neckline and your hem, and then pin the neckline the rest of the way around to hold it in place. So now that we've sewn the neckline facing onto the bodice, we can turn the neckline in, which will create the clean edge along this neckline. But because we have the curve at the neckline here, we first of all need to clip these seams. So take your clippers, and you want to clip every 3 centimeters or so around the curved edge only at the shoulder. You also want to clip back the edges of your seam allowance to remove any excess bulk when you turn this inwards. And then you can see when you start to turn the neckline in, the clipped edges open up, which will allow for movement within the neck. So before we iron the facing back, we need to first of all do a pin stitch, pinning together the facing and the seam allowance. So we're going to stitch along this edge here 3 millimeters, including all of these 3 seams, which will help to hold the facing back in place without continuously having to iron. So here is the pin stitch along the neckline facing edge, and that's stitched together the seam allowance and the facing at 3 millimeters the whole way around. And as you can see, that already helps to hold the facing inside the garment without even having done any ironing yet. When you're ironing the neckline facing down inside the garment, you want to be able to just see the edge of the seam allowance here, and that will mean at the front of the garment it's completely flat and smooth with no seam visible at all. So as you can see, the seam allowance is just visible on the inside edge, but on the other side it's completely flat and smooth. Here is our front neckline all completed with the facing pressed inwards. The last thing we need to do is ditch stitch the facing into the shoulder seam so that the facing is held inside and can't fold out when you're wearing it. So you want to sew it directly into the shoulder seam on both sides. There you have an invisible seam and your facing is held down. So now we're going to move on to the sleeves. So we can turn them the right way around to begin with. And with the sleeve head, there's gathering along the sleeve head, which helps to make your sleeves puffy. So the gathering that we're going to create sits between these 3 notches. So this is your center sleeve notch, and these 2 notches here are where we're going to gather between to create our puffy sleeve head. To gather the sleeve head here, we need to sew 2 rows of wide stitching. Set your stitch length to 5 millimeters, and then finding your notch, sew your first row only a couple of millimeters from the edge. And you want to leave the ends of your string long. And as you can see, that's already starting to gather in. And you want to go back to the beginning and sew a couple of mils in from your last stitch line. Leaving the ends long. And then as you can see, if you take the 2 pieces of thread at the end, if I can grab them, you can start to pull that in to create your gathered sleeve head. Now you can do the same with your other sleeve. Now you need to make sure you always get the right sleeve for the right armhole. So number 4 is the right sleeve and number 5 is the left sleeve, but you can also tell which is the correct sleeve by looking at the double notch, which is on both your sleeve head and your armhole. And you need to match these double notches, which indicates the back of the garment. And the front has a single notch, which you'll also match. When you're inserting the sleeve into the armhole, you want to start by matching your side seams together and pinning that in place. And then flip the sleeve to the inside of the armhole. Shuffle that around until it's kind of in position. Then you need to find your center sleeve notch and match that with your shoulder seam. If you ever get stuck, you can always refer your notches on your pattern as well. Then you need to match your double back notches and your single front notch, front sleeve notch. Now you need to adjust your gathering to fit within the 2 notches marked on the armhole. At the moment mine's too long, so you need to take the 2 ends and evenly gather in until you can match up those notches. And it can be a bit fiddly, and you need to make sure that you get the gathering as even as possible within that area. And then pin it in place. I always like to add lots of pins to the armhole because it can be quite tricky to get it all to stay together when you're on the machine. Take the 2 ends and gather in until your notches meet, and then pin in place. Probably gather that a little bit more. Then you need to pin the rest of the way around. And generally the sleeve is always slightly bigger than the armhole, and so you will need to stretch the armhole onto the sleeve. That added size of the armhole is so that you can actually move your arm when you're wearing the garment. Here is my sleeve all pinned together and ready to be sewn. We're going to sew the seam together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and then overlock that edge to finish. And once you've done this sleeve, you can move on to doing your other sleeve, and then we'll have 2 sleeves in our top. Now we have our puffy sleeves inserted into our top. And I've gone ahead and I have overlocked the ends of both of the sleeves hems here, and I have cut my 7mm elastic. Now I need to create the casing for our elastic sleeve hem. So we're going to have to roll the sleeve hem in at 1.5 cm and iron it flat so we can then sew that over. So get your measuring tape, measure at 1.5 and begin to iron flat. Next, we're going to sew along the folded edge at 1.2 centimeter seam allowance, leaving a small gap of approximately 3 centimeters to insert your elastic. Take your elastic and put a safety pin in both ends. Shove said safety pin into your casing and feed it the whole way around. And this end is to stop it from coming the whole way through. There is your jazzy hem. You want to overlap by 1 centimeter on each side. Pin it in place. Trim that bad boy back. And then close the rest of your casing. There is our elastic sleeve hem. Now we're going to create our skirt hem ruffle, which is this giant piece here. I have already gone and sewn the gathers along the top edge the same as we did this with the sleeve. So there are 2 stitches close together with a wide 5mm stitch length, which is then gathered in the top edge that will create our flouncy ruffle. So we're going to attach the ruffle to our skirt piece. So take your skirt and your ruffle. You're going to start pinning the right sides together. This end to fit on this piece. This is also quite fiddly. Not hard, just fiddly. Yeah, you've got to get all the gathers evenly spaced along your hem edge so that you get a nice even ruffle. So you keep moving all of your gathers along until it's sitting relatively evenly the whole way along. Pin your side seams together and then begin to evenly move your gathering to fit along the hem of your skirt. And then pin in place. Okay, then we're going to sew along this entire seam at 1 centimeter seam allowance and then overlock to finish. Here we have our finished skirt, which now has our ruffle attached and sewn with an overlocked finish hem. Now we need to finish the ruffle hem and the center front wrap edges, which are both finished with a 1 centimeter double turn hem, which I will show you how to do now. To do the 1 centimeter double turn hem on the skirt hem edge, on the wrong side of the fabric, you need to fold your hem in 1 centimeter and you do this the whole way along the hem edge, and then you fold again another centimeter, and that is your 1 centimeter double roll hem, which we're going to stitch along that line. So this is the center front wrap of the skirt, which is now neatly finished with the double turn hem, and so is the ruffle hem, and you can see the corners are all neatly folded and finished over. Here we have our finished top and our finished skirt ready to be joined together. So first you want to place the top and the skirt fabric right sides together and pin your center back notch. So the top and the skirt are actually slightly gathered to cinch the waist in and add fullness to the skirt. Matching your center back notch on both the skirt and the top. Matching your side seams. And match that center front edge with the center front edge of the neckline. And then pin both of your side seams, matching them up perfectly. Then pin the whole way along the waist seam. The waist is slightly gathered, so we need to do the gathered stitch seam along the waist as the same as we did on the sleeve hem and the skirt ruffle. So do the double row of stitching at the 5mm stitch length. Our dress is joined together, woohoo! Now we just need to finish off this waist seam. You've already gathered the 2 rows of stitching together, and you'll see on your spec sheet that there are measurements per size. So I'm making a size 8, which is 38 centimeter back width and 27 centimeters on both of the front widths. So you need to gather your waist seam in to match those measurements. And I like to tie off my gathering stitch ends to make sure that doesn't move when you put it on the machine. To neatly finish your center front, you want to encase the waist seam inside of your neck facing. So to do that, you need to turn the neck facing inwards to the inside of the garment to encase that seam and pin that in place. So once you have done that, you can set your machine back to your normal 2.5mm stitch length and stitch your waist seam together at a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So when you stitch the waist seam together, you stitch along that neck facing edge. Okay, so before we pull through our finished center front, you want to clip off these 2 corners to remove the excess bulk. Make sure you're not cutting through the stitching. And then when you pull it through, you have a finished encased center front. Then we have our 2 internal waist ties. One goes onto the left-hand side center front neck seam. So take your necktie and place it into the front tie and place it into the seam and pin it in place. And the other tie goes 16 centimeters in from the center front edge. You can sew those two in place. So to finish your tie, you need to fold it in half right sides together and pin along the whole edge of the tie, leaving a small gap open to then turn it the right way around. So you're going to sew along the tie edge the whole way along, leaving a small gap at the center back, and then do the same with the other side. Sew the whole way along and down the point. Now that you have sewn your tie, you want to clip the pointed edges to remove any excess bulk before you turn it inside, well, the right side around. Do the same with the other edge. Then get your loop turner, or you can use a chopstick or something of that nature, and you want to start to turn your tie the right way around. Then to get your pointed corners on the ends of your tie, take a pin and pick out your corner until you get a nice point. Then you need to iron your tie flat with the side seam perfectly on the side edge. And there is your belt. To close the center opening of your belt, fold the seam allowance inwards and press flat. Then we're going to pin stitch along the final edge to finish the belt. Voila, our dress is finito.